ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Introduction to Research Data Management Planning. Just change that. Introduction to Research Data Management, to Data Management Planning. So for those who have not had the benefit of attending the previous sessions, this is basically part of a series on research data management. It's a continuation of what we've covered over the past two sessions. So the first session was just a broad overview, general introduction to research data management. Yesterday, we then delved into the first step of the data management planning lifecycle. And then we had a gamified experience of playing around during the first stage of data management planning. Today, we'll go into a bit more detail about some conceptual aspects of data management planning, and then we'll eventually get a chance to actually have a look at the process of creating an actual data management plan. Yesterday, I did indicate that depending on how the software works, we might be able to share the data management plan so that you yourselves could actually interact with the tool. But as I indicated, this is not an institutional product. So Rose University does not subscribe to this product. So we don't have access to all the features of the product. So it won't be possible, from what it seems, for the data management plan to be shared so that you won't actually be able to create your own data management plans. Unfortunately, this means that you actually have to watch to actually go along the process. So you'll be learning by watching as opposed to learning by doing in this case. So in terms of the overview, what I'll do is I'll cover the fundamental aspects of data management planning, show you an example of a data management plan. Then I'll go through the core requirements of data management plans. Then there'll be the practical demonstration of an actual data management plan. Now, interestingly enough, as this session is starting, my colleague Toby has actually shared a link, or will share a link, which is for a diagnostic assessment for attendees to actually complete. And that will actually form the basis of the scenario for the practical demonstration. We'll assume that that is a research project that is actually being conducted and that the data are being collected from this audience. But that will make more sense when we get to that point. And then eventually, I'll just say a few things about the data management planning support that is provided at the university. And this is really for the benefit of those who have not attended the previous sessions. There will be a bit of repetition in terms of what we covered yesterday, and then a bit more detail. So anyone who's joining for the first time, you'll sort of like catch up a bit in terms of what we covered yesterday to a certain degree. So first things first, the fundamental aspects of data management planning. What is research data management? That's the actual starting point. In order to understand data management planning, you should have an understanding of research data management in the general sense. So we've defined research data management as a process which entails planning for the manner in which research data will be managed, importantly, during as well as after a research project. And secondly, controlling for the collection, processing, analysis, sharing, dissemination, curation, and reuse of research data. And this is a definition that actually emerges out of the research data management lifecycle that you see on the screen here, which has 6 stages as well as sub-stages for each of these stages. And these are those 6 steps that you see: data management planning, data collection, data processing and analysis, data sharing and dissemination, data curation, and finally, the reusing of data stage. And what we're focusing on today is literally the very, very first step, which is why I want to reiterate that if someone has missed out on the first 2 sessions, you're not too far behind in this case. So let's delve a bit deeper into data management planning. What is data management planning? Well, you can see the definition on the screen there. It's a process during which researchers describe the manner in which they plan to manage data during as well as after research projects. So things don't end just because a project has come to a close or to a conclusion. In practice, data management planning is something that should commence during the planning phase for a research project. That should be fairly obvious. So if you're actually supposed to apply for research funding or ethical clearance, you should already have a data management plan in place. In fact, what you'll find is that here at our university, our ethics committees, at least human ethics committees, they would actually ask questions relating to the manner in which you manage or intend to manage your research data. And if you're applying for research funding, what you'll find is that there are certain funders who actually require the submission of a data management plan, or they'll have questions that they ask you about how you intend on managing your research data, as well as how you intend to share your research data after the project has come to an end. So what you'll see is that in terms of the research grant lifecycle, and this is just another life cycle, you should consider data management planning during the pre-award phase before you even apply for funding. But interestingly enough, after you have received such funding, the data management plan will still have to also be updated accordingly. Essentially, it's a living document. So if you wanted to then describe or define the data management plan, you define it as an a priori description of how data will be handled both during and after a research project. I've indicated that the plans have to be updated throughout the study simply because things don't remain static throughout your research journey. So as things change and you have to pivot, you have to go and change the plan accordingly. It should reflect what's actually happening in your research project. And then the last point I want to make about data management plans themselves is that although they can be created and submitted to research funders, there are some funders who don't actually require the submission of data management plans. So what I want to underscore is the fact that the rationale for creating a data management plan should not be based on the fact that a funder wants you to submit the plan. Indeed, it's actually a part of good data management practice to actually have a data management plan from the outset, simply because it actually allows you to manage your research data more optimally. And some of these things will become a bit more obvious when you actually go through the questions that have to be answered when you actually create the data management plan. Now, what I indicated yesterday is that the data management plans themselves actually exist within a certain ecosystems. These are essentially documents, but they're not standalone documents. They're used in conjunction with various types of technological systems. So you make use of a data management planning software, but that could also be integrated or paired with a data repository. And you also have funder registries. All of these systems link up with what are known as machine actionable data management plans. So within the context of that ecosystem, the DMP takes the form of a document that can be read by software, hence the term machine actionability. It can be read by software, and the software can also make decisions based on the contents of the data management plan. Some of these things are not fairly obvious when you complete the plan. They actually take place behind the scenes. But the idea is that information can be pulled into the data management plan using data management planning software, and it can also be pushed to other systems. So for instance, a data management plan can actually recommend appropriate data repositories into which you can submit your data into after you're done with the research project. And the descriptions associated with the research project can be pushed out to a data repository. And those descriptions we refer to as metadata. So there's some kind of relationship that takes place between the data management plans and various types of other systems. Now, structurally, the data management plan actually asks researchers several questions. And there are several prescriptions that have been made in terms of the structure that a data management plan can actually take. There's none that is particularly authoritative, but there's one that I like, which is called the Core Requirements for Data Management Plans. This was developed by a consortium known as Science Europe, which is a consortium of several European funders, notable funders, for example, Horizon 20. And they basically come up with this list of requirements. And it resembles things that you find from other organizations, such as the Digital Curation Center, but they give you an indication of the kind of information that you'd want to be reflected in the plan. So firstly, you'd want a description of how the data will be collected or how the data will be used, the type of data documentation that will describe the research data, how the data will be stored, backed up, any legal and ethical requirements that the research data need to adhere to, or that you as a researcher need to adhere to whilst managing the data, how the data will be shared and preserved in the long term, as well as who will actually be responsible for the management of the research data. I will go into a bit more detail about the detailed aspects of those core requirements a bit later on during the session. Now, previously, I mentioned that there are funders who require that researchers should actually provide data management plans. And in order to facilitate this process, funders actually have their own templates that they use. And anyone applying for funding through a certain funder can then complete a funder template that actually adheres to the desires or wishes of that organization that's funding them. So by way of example, what you'll find is that this is a screenshot taken from software known as DMP Online that is used to generate data management plans. And there's a list here of various funders with their requirements. So if you look at the third column that has a list of various organizations, that is research funders, and they actually each have templates that you can find if you use DMP Online. So if you're being funded by the first funder on that list, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, you can simply click either the Word document or the PDF document, and you'll be able to get the funder requirements for that specific organization. Now, DMP Online was created by a European organization known as the Digital Curation Center around 2010. And the following year, the Americans also decided to create their own version. They called it DMP Tool, and they used the color blue instead of orange. But perhaps interesting enough is that the list of funders that you find here are all American funders. So if you're being funded by institutes that are actually based in the US, then what you'll find is that you can find their details here. Now, both of these tools do not necessarily have the broadest range of DMP templates. And by that, what I mean is that you have over 1,000 research funding organizations that exist, but you're not going to find 1,000 templates here. And what that underscores is that there are probably far more funders that do not have DMP mandates, or they may have the mandates, but they don't have the templates being readily available. But it's a good starting point to actually have a look at software platforms such as these if you want to get a template. And that's really largely dependent on who's actually funding your research. Where it's not possible, in this case, to get such a template, you might want to defer to your home institution to see if there's an internal in-house template. For the record, the university does not actually have such a template in place yet, but it's something that is being worked on. So if you wanted to look at how that intersection between institutional and funder templates actually works out, you can look at this diagram that gives you an idea of how things would work out. If you're conducting research that's actually not being funded, then that means you don't have any funder templates to actually worry about. But as I pointed out previously, it's part of good data management practice to actually still have a data management plan. In that case, what you'd want to do is to find out if there's any research data management policy that you can actually rely on at your institution. And if that institution guides you to any data management planning template that you can use. But if it turned out that your research is being funded, then there's a greater need for you to actually make use of a data management plan because the forcing function is coming from the funders. In that case, you'd have a look at the research grant application and you'll consider your funder requirements. And you'll have to answer the question whether or not your funder requires a data management plan. If the answer is no, then you'd have to go back to considering the institutional requirements. Does your institution require that you should have a data management plan? And in that case, if that is the case, is there a template that you can rely on? However, if the answer to that question about whether or not you should, your funder requires a data management plan is yes, then you need to find out if the funder actually has any data management plan templates available. Those funder templates, for example, that I showed you. If the funder does have any templates, then it is wise to actually make use of their templates. If the funder does not have any template, then you can actually defer to your institutional template. That is permissible in some cases when funders don't have their own templates. They don't mind if you use another template. In some cases, you don't need a broad template. You just need to simply answer a few questions about data management plan. Now, you might wonder exactly how do you create this data management plan? Do you just go to Microsoft Word and answer a few questions? Technically, you can do that, but the smarter way is actually to make use of data management planning software platforms. And I'll show you a couple of these. There's DMP Online. Another example is EasyDMP. There's DMP tool, Data Stewardship Wizard, Argos, Fair Wizard, and RDMO. There are plenty more examples. What I wanted you to know is that there's several examples. I've seen at least up to 20. Some of them are region specific or can only be used in a specific country. For instance, RDMO is only accessible, I think, in German. Yeah, and some of them are actually institution specific as well. But apart from RDMO, the rest are generic ones that can be used by just about anyone in the world. My personal favorite one is Fair Wizard, because this is a tool, as you come to see, that actually facilitates compliance with the fair data principles, which I've spoken about in the past 2 sessions. And the thing is, you might not necessarily have to understand or grapple with the intricate details of the fair data principles if you use a tool that allows you to align with the fair data principles. And that is the beauty of a tool like this. And you'll see that in a couple minutes' time. So the way that this tool works is that it allows you to actually create a data management plan, just like any other data management planning software does. You basically answer several questions relating to your research project, and then the tool would generate a data management plan, which can then be pushed out to interact with other tools. And this illustrates that ecosystem thing that I mentioned previously. Now, when you create the data management plan, it's important to understand that it serves 3 purposes. Now, I did mention that it's a priori document that describes how you plan on managing your research data during and after the research project, but it really does serve 3 purposes. Firstly, it's a planning document, which is obvious what I just mentioned, but it's actually more than just that. Secondly, it's a procedural manual. So it actually guides you as you actually work on your research project, which is why you'd actually want to update the document as you progress throughout your research journey. It's recommended that you do this every 6 months. You want to make sure that the data management plan is actually up to date. And the key reason behind this is because of the 3rd purpose. It's a historical record. So it serves a provenance role, meaning that when the project comes to an end, you can actually have a look at the plan, and you look at it retrospectively at least, and say that this is how I manage my research data. Whereas at the beginning, you're actually stipulating how you intend on managing your research data. And importantly, when the project has come to an end, the data management plan itself can actually serve as a form of data documentation. And for those who missed out on the first session, data documentation is basically a supplementary document which provides more detailed information about your research data. So generally, when the research data are shared, they're not shared in isolation. You have the research data files, and then you also have data documentation files, which provide context about the research data. And that's the role that a data management plan can actually serve as well. Are there any questions before I move on to showing you an example of a data management plan? Any questions from the online audience? Going once, going twice, going thrice. All right. So let's actually have a look at one of these things looks like. I'm going to show you an example of a make-believe project that I created. It's called the Make-Believe Project, fitting title. And it just shows you some information which is actually based on the core requirements loosely. What you'll see is that this plan here provides information about the type of data that will be created as part of this make-believe project, how the data will be created or collected. It provides information about the data documentation and metadata, any ethical and legal issues that will have to be considered. In this case, there were none that I opted for. How I will select data for preservation purposes, that is for long-term storage, so to speak. How the data will be shared after the project has come to an end, as well as who's actually responsible for the management of the research data. It could be you if you're the researcher, or if you're actually part of a research collaborative research project, you'll find that there could be a PI, a principal investigator, who's actually bearing the sole, or at least the overall responsibility for the management of the research data. In some institutions, that responsibility can actually lay with an academic supervisor. If you're a student who is doing a postgraduate study for postgraduate degree, your supervisor might actually be the person who will have some kind of role there. But ultimately, you as a researcher on the ground will be managing the data. With that having been stated, I did allude to the fact that there are the core requirements were what I use to structure that data management plan. And I actually just want to unpack those core requirements in a bit more detail. But the key thing that you should have taken from the previous slides is that the DMP takes the form of a document. Now, the requirements that I showed you were these ones that you see listed there. And what I'll do is I'll go through a guidance document that actually unpacks the kind of information that you need to provide in order to supply that kind of information. So the question is, how the first question that you see there is one is, how will new data be collected or produced, and or how will existing data be reused? You actually need to have an idea of what kind of information you need to provide. So there is some guidance documentation that exists that gives you kind of a list of what kind of info you can provide to answer that question for each and every one of those. So starting with the first one, 1A, and I won't go through all of the details, but for at least 1A, I'll go through that. If you had to provide information on how the data will be collected or reused, you would provide information explaining which methodologies or software you would actually use. You'd state any constraints on reuse that you would be facing. You would explain how the data provenance would be documented. And you'd also briefly state the reasons, if there are any, if the reuse of any existing data source has been considered but discarded. So these are pointers that Science Europe provided. So one can go through this document to get a bit of a pointer in terms of the kind of information that they need to supply to answer question 1A. And the same thing applies for 1B and 2A and 2B. So that's the detailed guidance for what kind of information you would actually have to provide. The same thing also applies for 3A. And these, the document itself is publicly available, but I've just basically broken it down into the slides. So a person can review this afterwards if they wanted to find out how they would actually answer certain questions relating to data security. What about data, metadata? What about personal data, etc.? And it covers each and every single one of those core requirements that you actually saw. So one does not need to worry too much about being lost. One can simply look at this document and get a bit of guidance. Now, previously, I did mention that there's some intersection between the core requirements and the fair data principles. And what I want to do is just, and I won't go into all of the fair data principles here because that is something that was talked about 2 days ago. But just to rehash what I stated previously is that the fair data principles cover findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability of the research data. And when you complete a data management plan, you want to ensure that the research data, or at least the management of the research data, would actually facilitate this or adhere to the FAIR principles so that the data that are generated as part of the project are actually FAIR compliant. So it would help if you could use a tool that guides you in that direction. And what I pointed out previously is that you want to make sure that your research data are open as possible, but as closed as necessary. Got that one right today. So we want to be on the top right-hand quadrant where the data are open and they're also fair. You do not want to be on the bottom left-hand side, which is data that are closed and not fair. But sometimes we do understand that compromises have to be made where research data have to be fair compliant, that is on the right-hand bottom side, but they have to be closed because they may be sensitive in nature due to legal privacy reasons, research contract restrictions, or it could be intellectual property restrictions. Now, this diagram here shows the interaction between the core requirements that I showed you previously and the FAIR data principles. So the FAIR data principles each have their own subcategories as well. So if we have a look at the left-hand side on the top, that is findability. There are 4 categories, subcategories, F1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, for instance, F1 states that data are assigned a globally unique and eternally persistent identifier. That is a persistent link. That fair requirement there is associated with core requirement 5D. So if you went back to the core requirements and you had a look at core requirement 5D, what you'd see is, and let me just go back just for your benefit, is that 5D, can't actually see it here. 5D asks the question, how will the application of a unique or persistent identifier, such as a DOI, be applied to each data set, and how will that actually be ensured? So you start seeing that the core requirements are meant to actually interact with the fair data principles. Sorry about zigzagging there. That was just a spur of the moment decision. But essentially what I want you to actually see is that you can actually see by working your way through the fair data principles, you'll indirectly comply with the core requirements. But perhaps it's actually better off to work the opposite direction. If you complete a DMP that complies or that adheres to or is based on the core requirements, what you'll find is that you'll comply with the fair data principles. The question then is, can you find a mechanism that allows you to do this? And you can if you use certain data management planning software platforms. And there are a couple that I showed you previously. Now, to my knowledge, not all of them are built from the ground up to actually comply with the fair data principles. There are at least 3 that I'm aware of here: Argos, Data Stewardship Wizard, and Fair Wizard, for example. They're built from the ground up, especially Fair Wizard and Data Stewardship Wizard. They were built from the ground up to actually comply with the fair data principles, meaning that as you actually create a data management plan using these software products, you will actually come up with a TNP that is fair compliant, although that is dependent on how you answer the questions. So just a bit more context in terms of how that works. And I'll use Fair Wizard as an example. Fair Wizard makes use of what's known as a smart form, which is essentially an electronic form that asks someone several questions. And after going through those questions, it will generate a data management plan. Now, just to zoom in a bit more details, the way that the questions are structured actually indicate which specific fair principle you're actually trying to comply with by answering a specific question. And as I indicated previously, if you're going through the core requirements, they are actually mapped to the fair data principles. So in the example that you see there, there's version 3. This question is, will you use common ontologies? And you see that it's related to the interoperability aspect of the fair data principles. So the thing is, can you get the core requirements into a data management planning software platform and then simply just answer those questions, and you have a DMP that is fair compliant? That should be the ultimate goal there. And a tool such as Fair Wizard is certainly capable of doing that. And it goes a step further. It actually generates metrics based on the fair data principles, as well as other metrics that you can add, but it can assess the findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability based on your responses. So that can give you a guide in terms of the degree to which your research data will comply with the fair data principles. And these are weighted scales that you can actually see there. So going back to this, the idea is, how do you get this? Basically, what you see is this is a report that is generated by Fair Wizard. So this report is actually based on that make-believe project that I showed you earlier on. And what it shows you on the top left-hand side is a summary of the entire data management plan and the weighted scores associated with the plan. And then for every single section, so the plan is divided into about 6 sections, there is a score associated with that, as well as a radar graph that you'll actually see. And the green results basically indicate high scores. And the lower the score, then the redder it is. So it's a bit orange in the middle. So you can clearly see, if you look at the bottom right-hand side, preservation of data, one of those fair requirements has a very poor score. And you can actually see that based on the red coloring here, there's a score of 0.15 out of, and the scale runs from 0 to 1. So immediately, if someone was reviewing this data management plan all they need to do is then go to the data management plan and they'll view it as a chapter, so to speak. They'll go to the form, they'll go to the section on preservation of data, and they'll be able to see those questions. That's where the problems would be. So a tool like this makes it very easy for someone to actually review a data management plan. And this is almost like giving the game away. I would have actually probably wanted you to see this afterwards, but given that you're not going to create your own data management plans today, you wouldn't be able to see it anyway. But a tool like this allows you to complete it, and you can already see where you went wrong. Now, we don't want to promote people sort of like gaming the system by only answering what they think would be the correct answers, because a tool like this can be designed to provide pointers. You want to provide honest answers. So, for instance, the tool might ask you if you plan on sharing your data, and you might think the best answer is yes. But sometimes you have to say no, and the follow-up question would be, provide the reason. Is it because of legal restrictions? And if that is the reason, because of data privacy restrictions, that would actually be a perfectly correct answer as well. But the main thing is that it helps to have something like this. So now I actually want to go to the practical demonstration. So pretty much just right on time that the technology decided to start failing on us, because we're not really going to be dependent on the slides for the next 30 minutes or so. So what we're going to do is we'll now go to Fair Wizard. Are there any questions before we jump into this demonstration? Any questions from the online audience? Okay, so what I'll do is I'll just go to the very next slide here, just so that we don't suffer from any lags when we return. So initially what I wanted to do is to actually share links to the data management plan that I created. So there's a template that I actually created, and the template itself is actually based on the core requirements that I actually showed you. And the idea was to actually just work through, assume that we're working on a research project that is literally based on questions that you've answered by coming to the session. So it has to do with attendance of RDM sessions. So in that case, when you filled in that diagnostic assessment, you provided your details, you provided your names, you provided your surnames. I think the department or unit that you're in, that was included as well. So there's some personal information, like your name and your surname. Those are personal identifiers. So to actually show you, this has been customized to include the colors of Rose University, but do not be deceived. Rose does not actually have its own institutional version of this tool. I just thought that it would actually make it look more perfect. This is an example of the data management plan that has actually been created in line with what you find in the core requirements. So if you were to actually start answering this, and all the answers are basically multiple choice examples, since we're not going to be able to have you go through it yourselves, what I'll do is I'll actually just walk you through this. But before I do, I just want to speak about some of the features of this tool. I indicated previously that it has the questionnaire, and it obviously has metrics. You can also preview your data management plan if you're using Fair Wizard, meaning that as you complete it, you can go to the preview, you can export the document. Since we haven't completed anything here, there's nothing to export. But that's why I showed you the example of what a data management plan would actually look like, so that I could sort of like preempt this process. But you can preview the document, you can export it as a PDF document, as a Word document, and if you want to share it in a machine actionable manner, you can export it as a JSON file. Now, in terms of the metrics, those would only show up if you've actually completed some responses. So for the most part here, you shouldn't find too many questions that I've already answered in advance. And it's only after you've completed all the questions for a particular section that you'll actually see the scores showing and those radar graphs being generated. So if you haven't finished, you won't see anything. The other thing I wanted to point out is that this tool does facilitate collaboration. So you can share the document with your, let's say if you're a student, if you're a postgraduate student, you can share the document with your academic supervisor, and the supervisor will then have the ability to either, like in this case, the supervisor can actually view the document, can make comments on the document, or they can edit the document. Ideally, you might want to be the only person who edits the document, whereas your supervisor can have the ability to make comments to the document, or they can simply just view the document. If the document is shared with funders, for instance, you probably want them to only be able to view the document. without being able to make any edits and perhaps make some comments. Now, the document does allow you to make some notes, call these to-do. And with the to-do list, what you do is you are able to, if you want to return to a certain section of the document, you can just place a note in, a reminder, so to speak, reminding you to actually come back and answer certain questions, for instance, that you struggle to answer, or for whatever reason you may want. The comments would be reflected in this panel here on the right-hand side. So if your supervisor makes any comments, that's where you would actually see them. And there is a version history. If someone decides to make a single comment or anything like that, and they've logged on into the system, there is an audit trail. So you can actually see who has actually made changes, what specific time they actually made those changes, so that the idea is that the document will not be manipulated by other people. And the document can have a digital object identifier. It can be shared with its own DOI, but that's not something that I would recommend. I'd say rather just download the document and upload it into a data repository where it can be published along with your research data, and collectively they would have their own DOI. Are there any questions about this before we start walking through the data management plan? All right. So these are standard questions that could apply to just about any research project. And if you actually, the reason why we've added these questions here is so that you don't necessarily have to go through the core requirements. Remember, I showed you that you can go through the core requirements and you can have a look at the guidance documents and you can figure out what you actually need to slot in. That's a painstaking way of actually doing it. I think it's easier to use the software. It basically allows you to accomplish that very same task. Now, the answers here are, for the most part, they would be the correct ones. But sometimes you might want to have another option, for instance, and that can be slotted into this. So if everything works out correctly, this can eventually become our version of an institutional template, but nothing has been ratified. Remember, I stated that we are currently shopping the RDM policy around, and it would point to an institutional template, but that is not something that is actually official. But hypothetically, something like this could actually serve the purpose of a template at the institutional level. So starting out, you'd actually indicate the methodologies and software that you use, but that is largely dependent on the type of research that you actually conducted. So in this case, what you see is the option would be either laboratory work, computationally generated data, field survey data, observational data, and I indicated that in this example, we're looking at data that is collected here in this setting amongst the attendees of this session. So we would actually tick off this. And you see immediately that it says that this answer was actually answered by me, Simon Samango, less than a minute ago, that provenance record that I actually made mention of. The next question is, well, are there any constraints on the reuse of this data? Given that there's personal information, your personal identifiers, your name and your surnames, that would probably be something that's there. There wouldn't be any IP constraints per se, no license constraints at all. So we would select this option. But as you can see, the answers that you actually select are context specific. In this case, they are dependent or informed by the actual research that is being conducted. So for the most part, I'd say there wouldn't be a wrong answer per se here. It's just that that is the most applicable one, the most accurate one that depicts the nature of this research project. Then we would actually go to the documentation and the provenance. In this case, what kind of data documentation would we use? Would we just rely on metadata fields? That is the source and date version of the data and how the data will be documented. Will we use version control systems? For those who remember from the very first session that we had 2 days ago, I mentioned that version control actually relates to software. So that would apply to Git systems such as GitLab or GitHub. That is not applicable in this context. What we've used is a survey. So normally, based on what I told you a few days ago, is that you would have a data dictionary that could be generated by the system. The one that we have probably doesn't have that. Let's assume that if it had that, then we would actually want to have that option there. But the option is not there. And we're certainly not going to use an electronic note lab because we're not conducting any laboratory research. However, I did point out that when all else fails for any type of research, you can generally use a written file. And that would be sufficient in this case. Where you have a data dictionary, you probably want to use that. Or if you wanted to use both, you could have the README file and the data dictionary. So we'll select the README file. So we'll say that we'll use a dedicated README file document, which will contain all the necessary information on data inputs and transformation steps. The answer here does also cater for protocols, but in an ideal scenario, you probably want that protocol option to be its own separate answer as well. In terms of good data management practices, you don't want to have two options merged together like this, but let's just ignore that for now. Then you'd go to the decision to discard existing data. Now, the questions that you see here apply to the entire research project. So they can be answered before the project has started, or as you work on the project, or even when you come to the end of the project. The decision to discard data is not something that would naturally be made at the very beginning, or at least certainly not in terms of what you see here. You might not actually know how these things would actually pan out at the beginning. So some of these questions you can actually leave blank. It's perfectly fine in certain instances, but the tool does actually allow you to modify the application of the question. So in designing this tool, you can, as an administrator, you can select when you want these questions to appear. So do you want it to appear in pre-planning phase or the pre-award phase, once the project has started, or when the project has come to an end? Now, I didn't actually adjust any of those settings here, but in a normal form, we would set this to appear only when the project has come to an end. When the person opts, the questions I would have to answer at the end, but not necessarily at the beginning. But for demonstration purposes, one would probably skip it. Or if we had come to the end of the project, we'd look at this and think, well, we would discard the data, either one, because of quality issues, that is if reuse was considered, but the quality was insufficient. Or secondly, incompatibility. Are the data incompatible or in an incompatible format or a non-standard unit? Or are the data outdated? Is a scope mismatch, that is, the data do not cover the necessary geographic, temporal, or demographic scope required by the project. You'll find that some of these may not necessarily be applicable. The data will certainly not be outdated, but once again, it is really context specific. So you need not always make the decision to discard the data as such, unless there's an existing reason. Then the next question is question 1B, that is, which details regarding your data format, type, and volume will be documented in your data management plan? And that is really dependent on the type of research you're conducting. So in this example, we're obviously dealing with text, the name of individuals, as well as the units that they belong to, or the categories. So that would be B, textual documents, interview transcripts. It wouldn't be numeric data, it's not media, and it's not geospatial. And ultimately, you will work your way down. And if you wanted to view the metrics here, you'll see that there's something that's actually happening there. There's a diagram that has actually been generated. And it shows you that to a certain degree, or at least insofar as those questions are concerned, they address reusability, findability, accessibility, and interoperability. And you can actually see that when you look at these diagrams, when you look at the questions themselves as well. So as you answer these questions, you can see which specific component of the FAIR data principles you're actually trying to address. Are there any questions regarding this section? There are only 3 more that we'll cover here, because there's obviously not enough time for us to go through all of these questions. I'll complete these ones, and then I want to show you the important ones dealing with the publication of data, which is where people can be thrown off in that case. Because you plan for this, and then at the end of the project, you need to make sure that you don't actually stumble as well. So in terms of data formatting, in this case, we would just basically pick. I don't know if anyone remembers what we covered about the file formats on the very first session. I said that we have to use
Excel.
Yes, that was Excel. So that was we have to use open file formats. So non-proprietary ones. So the XML one would be something that we would accept. Generally, we would go for a CSV if it's a spreadsheet. In this case, we're using textual data. So we would actually, if we use Microsoft Word, we would make sure that it's the XML version. So that's the DOCX file extension. So we would actually select this option. Now, in the very first session, there was a link in the slide that actually takes you to a website that gives you, for any given type of data, the recommended types of file formats, as well as the acceptable ones. But in this case, that's what we would use. We would not use proprietary software in this case, such as Microsoft Word, or at least unless it's the XML version. If it was a CSV, if it was a spreadsheet with tabular data, we would use a CSV as opposed to an Excel spreadsheet. We won't use a repository preferred format in this case, or research community standard. It's more ideal to use the open standard formats. And this is actually a question that flows from the previous one, the justification for your format use. And I'm not going to ask people to necessarily justify this, but we mentioned it 2 days ago, is that you'd actually have to mention, you have to pick whether you're relying on staff expertise. And that is really something that would be the case if you're working with some unique kind of software, where you're picking that software because someone needs some expertise to use it. If you look at the software and equipment login, where it says the format is necessary because it is the only output option for the specialized equipment analysis software, that's not really applicable here. So you would skip that one. And you notice that out of these 4 options, one of them actually has the green options. It's a bit of an indicator that that's the one to use, but I say we don't want to game the system and have people only picking things that have indicators like that. You might indicate that there's no need for an open format if you select D due to legal or ethical restrictions, that the data will not be shared, so you don't need to worry too much about this option. But you might have to share the data privately with someone, and you don't know if they have access to your proprietary software or not. So the best option would be, in order to facilitate sharing, which is C. So you'd have chosen file formats like the XML one that you mentioned previously, or it could be RDF as well. And these formats are designed to facilitate data sharing and machine readability. And then the last question under this section is about the data volume. Now, this one you might not know in advance. The question is, how much data are you going to generate? Is it a small volume, medium volume, large volume, or is it defined by the object? Now, it's fair to state that there is no right or wrong answer here. This is just a question about how much data you're generating. If you're in a field that works with big data, and you know that you generate big data files, you will probably indicate that you will generate 1 terabyte of data. It's not a wrong answer as such. The question is, does your university or institution have enough data capacity to store the data? But that's another issue. If you know that you actually generate between 1 to 1 terabyte data, then that's what you'll click there. Or if it's 1 gigabyte to 1 terabyte, that's what you select. In this case, we're working with a very small group. You could even generate less than 1 gig, but I'll play it safe and put 1 gig to 1 terabyte because that's a very broad range. And then we can actually go to the metrics. And what you'll see is that you have your description. In fact, you have the overall project's summary here. But if you scroll down, you'll see that in terms of the data description and collection or reuse, you also have a profile that's been generated, or at least a radar graph. But obviously, there's nothing else for the other sections because that is not something that we have actually completed. Now, the link to this can actually be shared with you. And in your own time, you can actually go and complete this, and you'll see what the results would look like. Bearing in mind that I'm working off the master copy of this data management plan. So if everyone was actually logging simultaneously, you will actually be changing each other's answers. And that's not necessarily what we want, which is why we're actually working off one sheet. But in your own time, if you wanted to, you could actually go and play around with this. If you're the only one who's actually logged in, you can actually view the answers and you can chop and change them accordingly. Are there any questions about how this process works out? Is this something that makes sense, something that you can follow through if you actually had to complete the rest of these questions? Oh, there's a question, Tabitha, or a comment? Yeah, most of them, yeah, you can do that. You can do that. Okay, so what I'll do now is I'll jump to the storage section. Sorry, the data sharing section. In fact, let me just parse through these. What I want to show you is that what this DMP shows that the optimal answers are generated in green. But as you can see, you have all of these answers being green, meaning that you can't game the system by just saying, I'll pick the green one, because in this case, you can only pick one. Although for this option, if you pick it, you'll find that there is another question that pops up. So for instance, if you had your data sharing strategy and you're asked, how will you actually make the data open accessible for long-term purposes or discoverable, you'll say, I plan to use deposit my data in a repository. And then if you select that option, you will be asked to identify a specific data repository in question. Now, in a more customized version of this tool, what you'd have is some kind of integration between Fair Wizard and another platform so that you could have a drop-down list that allows you to actually pick from that list instead of having to guess your way through it. So the idea behind using a tool like this is really to make the process easier for you to actually generate a data management plan. But what you will observe is that there are instances where the tool will indicate what the worst answer would be. And in a way, you can avoid that answer. But it's sort of, I wouldn't call it cheating, but it's guidance so that in case you're planning on managing your data that way, you would know immediately that it's associated with a red flag. If you had to look at the data sharing option, you'll find that sometimes there are optimal and suboptimal responses. So if we go to the legal section, you'll see that some of those answers are actually in amber or red, and they're sort of like in between. And you find that you might not necessarily always have the most optimal answer, or at least it doesn't necessarily come without its own shortcomings. So the rule of thumb is to basically be as honest as possible when you actually complete a data management plan using a tool of this nature. And I think that pretty much covers this. Are there any questions about this DMP, or can we go back to the presentation slides?
Yeah, okay.
Go back to the press. Let's just go back to the, I just want to ask from the online audience, do you have any questions about the data management plan in this case?
Yes, just wanted to find out, as you were presenting, I was trying to...
Sure, go ahead.
The Fair Wizard, can you access it with any of the internet browser, or you have to cross-stage?
Sorry?
The Fair Wizard,
yeah,
the tool for the data and plan.
Yeah.
Can you access it online?
Yeah, so this is it's available online. So for instance, this DMP here can be accessed online. So I could share it. So it could be visible only to the two options. You can make it visible to anyone who has logged into Fair Wizard. So the idea would be for you to, for instance, log in, create an account, and then try to log in. So that was the idea behind the sessions, to have the attendees log in. But there were technical challenges that we faced. We tried that and saw that it wasn't actually working out. And even if people actually created their accounts, they weren't necessarily able to access the DMP individually because you wanted to create a copy of this. So what I did instead I shared it publicly with the idea that people could at least edit the document. So that is the setting now. And what it does then is it allows you to copy this link here. And I sent that to my colleague Toby and asked her to just share it in the group here, or it's in the online channel, meaning that you can actually click it and then you'll see the same exact plan, which is why I was saying that in your own time, you'd be able to work through it. It's just that because we don't have it at the institutional level, it means that you will be accessing the exact master copy that I've made. And if she logs in at the same time as you, and she also logs in at the same time as you, you would be changing each other's answers. And that's not what we actually want. So if we had it as an institutional tool, let's say subscription, then that problem would actually fall away. It's just that this is just for demonstration purposes. But yes, with this link that you're getting, you can actually go and you can work your way through it. I'll put raise my hand. Okay. All right. So I see that we don't have I've been told that there's a hand here. There's an Electra. Go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, I was saying my question would have been, it sounds like it's almost similar to the previous person, because as you were presenting, I went onto the website for the Fair Wizard, and I was trying to create a profile. I see there is a free version. My only question was, I had managed to do that, but when there's this domain, is it the domain that has to be aligned or linked to your institution, or because when they give the description on what the domain is, they say it can be anything. So I'm not really sure.
Yeah, it can be anything. So you could, for instance, use your name, and we were testing that early on before the session. So for instance, you
Yeah.
could use your, I used one, well, mine is the RUL one, but no one else can use it. So it seems like it has to be very unique. So that could be a stumbling block.
Okay.
So it could be your name plus a number, for instance. So you could put electron
Oh,
one.
okay.
Yes, and
Okay.
then that would actually get you through. So if you register like that, then you'd be able to log in and see this data management plan. But because the link has been shared public as well, you wouldn't be able to access it in any case. But what I'd want is for people to be able to access it and then create a copy of the data management plan, which they can then edit on their own. It's just that the platform seemed to be experiencing errors this morning. So even one of my colleagues failed to create a profile successfully because the platform is having problems. So I realized that it would probably give us problems during a practical demonstration if it's not working for everyone. But I haven't had problems. But long story short is that you can use your own name and a number to create a unique domain.
Okay. All right. No problem. It still says loading, so maybe it's taking time. It's fine. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lag in the system. I think Toby tried it early on this morning, and they kept loading for the longest time. And that's when I realized we won't be able to use it in this demo if it's going to be loading. It should
Yeah.
something that works within at least a minute or two. But
Okay. Thank you. No problem.
You're welcome. Any other questions from the audience, the online audience? Okay, so it seems that there are no questions there. So what I'll do is I'll just try to wrap things up by going back to the presentation by reiterating, and this is largely for the benefit of those who have missed the other two sessions or one of the previous ones, that we do have resource data management support at the university. It's a service that we're still building out in terms of our offering. So for more information, one can actually make use of the resource data management library guide. This will provide you with information about research data management in the general sense, and there's also specific information about data management plans. Secondly, one can make use of what's known as the Resource Data Management Adventure Game. This is a game that we played during yesterday's session in order to learn how you can actually practically apply the principles of data management planning. So this is a simulated example of the application of a data management plan or creation of a DMP. Is there a question that we're... Okay, it turns out that there's a question in the chat. Has it been posted or someone wants to raise their hand up? Is it the one here about no? Oh, okay. It's not so clear differentiating between openness from accessibility. Please expand. Okay, so those two are intertwined. So when you look at it from the context of, and I'd like for you to at least view it from the context of the FAIR data principles. And I hope you're asking this because when we looked at the metrics, there was a section for accessibility as well as openness. The openness aspects really relates to the degree to which you can actually acquire a digital object or at least retrieve something without necessarily having to pay for it. So in terms of the open access movement, the idea is that your only barrier to obtaining a resource such as a paper or research data should be your access to the internet in terms of money. So if there's a paywall and you actually have to pay for it. But if you can actually go online and you can type in a search using an online search engine and you can find a data set, usually based on the fact that it has a persistent link, then we'll say that it's open. So if you look at the way academic journals work, you have open access articles, which can be accessed by anyone without having to pay. But sometimes you find that there's a fee that is actually charged in order to access these articles. So you can find them, but you'd have to pay in order to retrieve those things. Now, in that process of getting to the article, you find that you were able to get to it. So you did discover it, but it's actually closed off. But when you look at the fair data principles and they speak of accessibility, that is intertwined with the openness in the sense that the documents will be accessible, ideally if they are actually open. But that entails having correct metadata that makes them accessible. So what are the descriptions that describe the article, the data set? Is there a digital object identifier or a link that is associated with the research data, a link that will not decay or rot after a year or two, that is persistent and is supposed to be something that exists forever, conceptually at least. So the accessibility is a bit broader than that. Technically, you can access something that is closed in terms of arriving at its doorstep, but you won't be able to get to it unless you actually pay. So the openness is really about the aspect of whether or not you actually have to pay to get to it. The accessibility is, can you discover it? And actually, can you actually not just arrive at it in terms of discovering it, but can you also actually retrieve it if it's actually openly accessible? So briefly summarize, accessibility and openness look at the degree to which you can discover something and ultimately retrieve it, gain access to it. And in order for that to happen, it has to at least be open. Does that clarify that aspect for you? All right. Thank you so much. That was a very good question, by the way. First time I've had to deal with that one. Are there any other questions? I'm willing to just pause for a minute. I don't want to just speed through this. If there are any questions, I'm willing to actually answer them. All right, I'll take it that there are none in this case. So what I was saying is that another resource that people can use, at least if you just play the very first level, is the RDM adventure game, which is a self-teaching sort of serious game that can allow you to actually learn about the principles where you can actually test your knowledge of data management planning. Or if you don't have time for consultation, you can actually go through this, and it's a self-learning tool. The very first level is what deals with data management planning. It would only take about 10 to 15 minutes to actually play it. And then thirdly, the library itself actually has certain support services that it actually provides. So that is data stewardship services, and that it includes reviewing of data management plans. We actually do manage data in our data repository, and we curate the data. And then we have user support services such as consultations or related training sessions, and you're attending one of those related training sessions. Now, what I want to point out about the review of the data management plans is that insofar as an institution like Rose does not actually have an institutional data management planning software in place, you actually have to review some of these plans manually, and that is a painstaking process. But if you have a tool that is deployed at the institutional level, you can have an institutional template that is used, and everyone can actually create data management plans based on that template, unless they actually have to adhere to funder templates, in which case we say you actually have to use the funder template. But if that's not present, then you can use such an institutional data management planning template. That is the actual aspiration at the moment. And if you would like to contact us for further information or assistance, you can see my email address over there, as well as Ms. Tobilin Tetra's email address. And that brings us to the end